What if the person living right next door, someone you saw every day, someone you thought you knew, was harboring a chilling secret? This is the story of Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who blended into the neighborhood for 20 years, all while hiding a trail of terror that spanned decades. It took just one DNA test to unravel his carefully concealed crimes and reveal the true horror of what he'd done. DeAngelo, later identified as the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer whose reign of terror gripped California for over a decade. His crimes were ruthless, his methods calculated, and his victims countless. For years, he evaded justice, living quietly in plain sight. Today, we'll uncover how investigators finally solved one of the most infamous crime sprees in U.S. history and brought this serial predator to justice. The story of the Golden State Killer begins with his victims, innocent individuals and families living ordinary lives in peaceful neighborhoods, unaware of the terror that would shatter their worlds. In the mid-1970s, communities in Sacramento and Contra Costa counties became the initial targets of a series of burglaries and assaults. These early victims were often young couples or single women, living in homes they believed to be safe. Their lives were filled with the mundane joys and challenges of daily life, raising children, building careers, and making plans for the future. One couple, Brian and Katie Maggiore, represent the tragic reality of this story. Newlyweds with their whole lives ahead of them, their love and optimism were abruptly taken during a brutal attack in 1978. Families like theirs became central to the case, each left with shattered lives and unanswered questions that would linger for decades. The Golden State Killer's crimes followed a horrifying progression. His criminal activity began in 1974 with a string of burglaries in Visalia, California. These weren't just any burglaries. They were calculated, leaving victims feeling violated and fearful. By 1976, his crimes escalated to sexual assaults in Sacramento. Known at the time as the East Area Rapist, he targeted suburban neighborhoods, often stalking his victims for days before striking. The timeline of his attacks reads like a nightmare, stretching over 12 years. By 1978, his crimes expanded to include murders, starting with the Maggiores. His reign of terror reached its peak in the early 1980s as he moved to Southern California, leaving behind a trail of 13 murders and over 50 sexual assaults. Despite the brutality of these crimes, the Golden State Killer managed to evade capture, leaving investigators baffled and communities paralyzed by fear. It wasn't until decades later, with advancements in DNA technology, that the pieces began to fall into place. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is the man behind it, Joseph James DeAngelo. Born in 1945, DeAngelo grew up in a military family and later served in the U.S. Navy. After his military service, he pursued a career in law enforcement, working as a police officer in small California towns during the time of his crimes. To his neighbors and co-workers, DeAngelo seemed like just another member of the community. He had a family, worked regular jobs, and lived in quiet suburban neighborhoods. This ordinary exterior made him an unlikely suspect, allowing him to continue his crimes undetected for years. DeAngelo's dual life, criminal and community member, added a layer of complexity that stymied investigators for decades. Meanwhile, his victims and their families were left to grapple with the aftermath of his horrific actions. California in the 1970s and 1980s was a state of contrasts, an era defined by cultural change and suburban expansion. The Golden State Killer's crimes unfolded during a time when communities were growing and many families were seeking the safety of suburban life. The neighborhoods he targeted, from Sacramento to Santa Barbara, were picturesque and peaceful, the kind of places where doors were left unlocked, and neighbors greeted each other with a smile. But as news of his attacks spread, fear consumed these communities. Residents began locking doors and windows, installing security systems, and sleeping with weapons by their bedsides. The media dubbed him the East Area Rapist, and later the original Night Stalker, as his crimes spread across the state. This period of terror left an indelible mark on California's collective memory, serving as a grim reminder of the vulnerability lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. One of the most harrowing chapters in the Golden State Killer's story unfolded on the evening of February 2, 1978, in Rancho Cordova, California. Brian and Katie Maggiore, a young married couple, were out walking their dog in their suburban neighborhood. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, filled with the promise of a peaceful stroll. But their walk took a tragic turn when they crossed paths with a man who had been stalking the area. Details of what exactly transpired remain chilling. Witnesses later reported hearing gunshots and seeing Brian and Katie attempting to flee. Brian was shot first, collapsing in the street, while Katie was pursued into a backyard and shot as well. The crime scene offered few clear answers, leaving investigators to piece together a fragmented and horrifying picture. This marked one of the Golden State Killer's earliest known murders, a shocking escalation from the burglaries and assaults he had committed previously. But the Maggiore case was far from an isolated incident. In the mid-1970s, Sacramento County experienced a terrifying wave of sexual assaults attributed to a man the media dubbed the East Area Rapist. Victims described waking up in the dead of night to find an intruder in their homes. The attacker's methodical approach was terrifying. He often cut phone lines, left windows unlocked, or manipulated locks in advance. He came prepared, bringing ligatures to tie up his victims and wearing a ski mask to conceal his identity. In one particularly haunting case, a couple awoke to the sound of footsteps in their home. Before they could react, the attacker appeared in their bedroom, holding a flashlight and a weapon. He forced the husband to lie face down, binding his hands and feet, and then separated him from his wife. For hours, the attacker tormented them, leaving behind a trail of psychological and physical scars. This pattern would repeat itself in dozens of homes, each crime as horrifying as the last. Victims who survived these attacks described the Golden State Killer with chilling precision. He was calculated, always a step ahead. He wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and carried a kit containing everything he needed to commit his crimes. Victims recalled his whispered threats and an eerie voice that seemed to revel in their fear. One of the most unsettling details was his habit of taunting law enforcement and victims. In 1977, he called a victim he had attacked months earlier, whispering the words, "Remember when we played?" Another time, he left crude handwritten notes at crime scenes. Despite these taunts, he left little physical evidence. Investigators collected traces of DNA, shoe prints, and tire marks. But these were not enough to identify him in an era before modern forensic techniques. The attacks sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who once felt safe in their homes now lived in constant fear. Stores sold out of locks, alarms, and guard dogs as families fortified their homes against an unseen threat. The fear wasn't confined to Sacramento. It spread as the attacks moved to other parts of California, including Contra Costa County in Southern California. The mounting pressure on law enforcement was immense. Task forces were formed, and investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots between the assaults, burglaries, and murders. Despite their efforts, the Golden State Killer seemed to vanish after each crime, leaving behind traumatized survivors in a community gripped by paranoia. The media played a significant role in amplifying the fear. News reports detailed each attack, often speculating about the identity and motives of the perpetrator. Some speculated he had law enforcement training, as his methods suggested an intimate knowledge of police procedures. The public's frustration with the lack of arrests only added to the pressure on authorities, who were desperate for a breakthrough. Every crime committed by the Golden State Killer added another layer of terror to the communities he targeted. The brazenness of his actions and the psychological torment he inflicted made him one of the most feared criminals of his time. As the years went by, the urgency to catch him grew, but his identity remained a mystery, hidden in plain sight. The hunt for the Golden State Killer spanned decades and became one of the most complex investigations in U.S. history. From the mid-1970s through the 1980s, law enforcement agencies across California faced an unprecedented challenge. The crimes were spread out over multiple jurisdictions: Sacramento, Contra Costa, Orange County, and beyond. Communication between police departments was limited, with no centralized database to connect the dots between cases. Investigators initially believed they were dealing with several unrelated criminals. In Northern California, he was known as the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, he was dubbed the original Night Stalker. It wasn't until 2001, through advancements in DNA technology, that investigators realized these two criminals were, in fact, the same person. This revelation united efforts, but by then, Decades had passed since his last known crime. The challenges didn't stop there. DNA profiling was in its infancy during the time of the attacks. While crime scenes provided valuable samples, investigators had no viable way to match them to a suspect. They also faced the issue of time. Evidence deteriorated, memories faded, and witnesses moved away or passed on. Each setback only added to the frustration of law enforcement and the growing fear in the communities he terrorized. Everything changed in 2018. After years of stalled progress, investigators made a breakthrough using an innovative technique known as genetic genealogy. They had preserved DNA from multiple crime scenes, and while traditional methods couldn't identify a suspect, they decided to try something new. Detectives uploaded the crime scene DNA to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. Unlike criminal databases, GEDmatch contains DNA profiles submitted by everyday people curious about their ancestry. By comparing the killer's DNA to profiles on the site, investigators identified distant relatives of the unknown suspect. From there, they painstakingly built a family tree, narrowing down the list of potential suspects. The process was not quick or straightforward. Investigators worked backward through generations, cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, and other public documents. The hard work paid off when the trail pointed to one man, Joseph James DeAngelo. But the road to DeAngelo wasn't without its detours. Over the years, law enforcement pursued countless leads, many of which turned out to be dead ends. Some suspects were misidentified, leading to temporary arrests or intense public scrutiny of innocent individuals. For example, one man in Southern California was accused and later cleared, his life forever altered by the accusation. In another twist, investigators received taunting calls and letters from someone claiming to be the killer. These false leads distracted from the case and added to the psychological toll on law enforcement. The breakthrough in 2018 came as a surprise even to seasoned detectives. After years of frustration, they finally had a name. Joseph James DeAngelo was an unassuming man. A Navy veteran and former police officer, he had spent years hiding in plain sight. DeAngelo served as a police officer in the 1970s, ironically tasked with upholding the very laws he was secretly breaking. After being fired from the force for shoplifting, he worked as a mechanic and later retired quietly in a suburban neighborhood. Neighbors described DeAngelo as ordinary, perhaps a bit gruff, but never suspected him of anything sinister. He raised a family and lived what appeared to be a stable life. But investigators uncovered a darker side. DeAngelo's military and law enforcement training likely contributed to his ability to evade capture for so long. He knew how to cover his tracks, manipulate crime scenes, and stay one step ahead of his pursuers. When law enforcement finally closed in on DeAngelo in April 2018, they took no chances. He was arrested outside his home, where he had lived for years, blending into the community. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, linking him to multiple murders and assaults. After decades of fear, frustration, and tireless effort, the Golden State Killer was finally in custody. DeAngelo's arrest marked the culmination of a relentless pursuit of justice. It was a testament to the dedication of law enforcement and the power of modern forensic science. But as investigators would soon discover, the story didn't end with his capture. It was only the beginning of uncovering the full extent of his crimes. On April 24, 2018, after decades of eluding law enforcement, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The breakthrough came from a revolutionary use of genetic genealogy, tying him to a series of crimes that had haunted California for over 40 years. Law enforcement officers surrounded DeAngelo's suburban residence, catching him entirely off guard. Despite his history of meticulous planning and evasion, the man once known as the Golden State Killer could no longer hide. Inside his home, investigators found items of interest, including personal possessions that linked him to several crime scenes. Though he initially tried to maintain a stoic demeanor, his arrest revealed cracks in the persona he had maintained for decades. DeAngelo, who had once been a police officer, now faced justice from the very system he had sworn to serve. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA from multiple crime scenes matched samples taken from DeAngelo. These links were indisputable, cementing the connection between the man in custody and the crimes committed from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. Despite his capture, the road to justice was far from over. DeAngelo's arrest was only the first step in a complex and emotionally charged legal process. Joseph James DeAngelo's trial was one of the most anticipated in modern criminal history, drawing the attention of victims, their families, and the nation. Initially, DeAngelo pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted, he changed his plea. In a dramatic court hearing on June 29, 2020, DeAngelo confessed to 13 murders and over 50 rapes across 11 counties. His guilty plea also included admissions of crimes beyond those officially charged, acknowledging his role in acts that had left deep scars on communities. The trial proceedings were filled with emotionally charged moments, none more powerful than the victim impact statements. Survivors and family members stood before DeAngelo to share their pain, anger, and resilience. One by one, they recounted the terror he inflicted and the lasting impact of his crimes. Some survivors, now in their 60s and 70s, spoke directly to him, ensuring their voices were heard after years of silence. DeAngelo sat in court, often expressionless and confined to a wheelchair, a stark contrast to the predatory figure described by his victims. At one point, he muttered the words, "I admit," as part of his guilty plea, offering the closest thing to a confession he would ever provide. For many, his demeanor during the trial seemed detached, but his silence spoke volumes about the weight of his actions and the walls of accountability closing in around him. In August 2020, after months of legal proceedings and heartfelt testimony, DeAngelo was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Judge Michael Bowman delivered the sentence, describing DeAngelo's actions as simply staggering in their breadth and depravity. The courtroom, filled with survivors and their families, erupted in a mixture of relief and emotion. For the victims and their loved ones, the sentencing marked a significant moment of closure. While the pain of their losses could never be undone, there was solace in knowing that DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Many reflected on the decades of fear and uncertainty that his crimes had caused and expressed gratitude to the investigators, prosecutors, and advocates who had tirelessly pursued justice. DeAngelo was transferred to California State Prison Corcoran to serve his sentence. There he would live out his remaining years under constant watch, a far cry from the freedom he had once enjoyed. His sentencing sent a powerful message. No matter how much time passes, justice can prevail. For the communities of California, the case was a stark reminder of the resilience of those affected and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror had finally ended, not in darkness, but in the light of justice and accountability. For the victims and their families, the aftermath of the Golden State Killer's arrest and conviction was both a moment of justice and a painful reminder of the terror that had haunted their lives for decades. Many survivors who had lived in fear for years were finally able to confront the man who had ruined their sense of safety. For some, the sense of closure was not immediate. There were still painful memories and unresolved emotions to grapple with. But the moment of DeAngelo's conviction offered a sense of validation. The truth had come to light, and the perpetrator would face the consequences of his crimes. Some of the victims' families had lived with the anguish of unsolved cases for years, enduring years of uncertainty, wondering if their loved ones' deaths would ever be explained. For these families, the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo brought an end to a long, torturous chapter of their lives. Relatives of those murdered were able to grieve openly, knowing that the person responsible for the deaths of their loved ones would never hurt anyone again. One survivor, who had been attacked in 1976, described how hearing DeAngelo's guilty plea gave her a sense of justice. She spoke of the years spent haunted by the memory of the attack, her inability to find peace knowing that the man who had terrorized her and many others was still out there. The emotional weight was so heavy, she said, that hearing DeAngelo admit to his crimes was almost a relief. For many victims, the long-awaited acknowledgement of their suffering allowed them to begin the process of healing. For the community, especially in California, there was a profound sense of collective relief. The Golden State Killer had terrorized not just individuals, but entire neighborhoods. His presence, though unseen, was felt by many. People locked their doors tighter, stayed inside after dark, and lived in constant anxiety, wondering if they would be next. In some communities, the fear became ingrained in their daily routines. Now, with DeAngelo behind bars, they could begin to rebuild their sense of security. Joseph DeAngelo's arrest and subsequent conviction marked a turning point in the field of criminal investigations. For decades, law enforcement had faced dead ends in the hunt for the Golden State Killer. Traditional methods, including eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and forensic analysis, had failed to provide the necessary clues to catch the killer. But in 2018, investigators used an innovative technique, genetic genealogy, to finally make the connection between DeAngelo and the crimes. Genetic genealogy involves using public genealogy databases like GED-Match, where people voluntarily submit their DNA to trace their ancestry. By comparing DNA found at crime scenes with DNA profiles uploaded by users of these databases, investigators were able to identify potential relatives of the suspect. This technique allowed law enforcement to trace the DNA to DeAngelo, who had never been a suspect until that point. This breakthrough in forensic science is a game-changer in criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer case is now seen as a landmark in the use of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. It opened the door for law enforcement agencies across the country to begin using the technology to solve previously unsolved crimes. However, it also raised concerns about privacy and the ethics of using genetic databases in criminal investigations. Critics argue that the use of public genetic data without individuals' explicit consent raises significant privacy issues, while others believe it's a necessary tool for solving heinous crimes. The Golden State Killer case, in many ways, set the stage for the ongoing debate about the balance between privacy and justice in the age of technology. Despite the sense of closure that DeAngelo's arrest brought to many, the case is not without its lingering questions. As investigators dug deeper into the timeline of his crimes, one of the big questions that surfaced was whether DeAngelo had additional victims who may not have been identified yet. The timeline of the Golden State Killer's attacks spans from 1974 to 1986, with his crimes stretching across California. He was believed to have committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and countless burglaries. But law enforcement officials believe there may have been even more crimes tied to DeAngelo that have not yet been uncovered. Some law enforcement experts suspect that the true number of his victims could be higher, as DeAngelo's crimes evolved over time. His early offenses, which began as burglaries and rapes, escalated into murders, and there may have been other attacks that have gone undetected or that have not yet been linked to him. Furthermore, there's the question of how long DeAngelo had been planning and committing these crimes before he was eventually caught. His meticulous behavior, his careful surveillance of victims, and his ability to remain hidden for so many years suggest that his crimes may have gone back even further than initially believed. Could there be other victims, not yet connected to him, whose stories are still waiting to be told? Another lingering question revolves around DeAngelo's motivations. While his actions clearly caused immense harm, many people still wonder what drove him to commit such heinous acts. DeAngelo's past as a police officer and his military service in the Navy provide some insight into his background, but investigators and experts still seek to understand what truly pushed him to commit these crimes. Lastly, the question remains whether justice was truly served. While DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, many families and survivors were left to ponder whether he had more to confess. Would he ever provide a full confession to all his crimes? Would he ever name additional victims or provide closure to those still seeking answers? Many victims' families expressed a desire for him to speak the truth about all his crimes, hoping to bring finality to the years of unanswered questions. Joseph James DeAngelo's case is one of the most complex and haunting true crime stories of the 20th century. It raises important questions about the role of technology in solving crimes, about the long-lasting effects of trauma on victims and communities, and about the ways in which justice is pursued, even decades after a crime has been committed. Though the Golden State Killer has been caught and convicted, the ripple effects of his actions will be felt for generations to come. This case is a reminder of the extraordinary lengths justice can go to, even decades later. What happened with Joseph DeAngelo is a clear testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the groundbreaking role of technology in solving crimes. The Golden State Killer's arrest after so many years shows us that no matter how long it takes, the truth can eventually come to light. The use of genetic genealogy, which was pivotal in this case, has sparked a bigger conversation. What do you think about using DNA technology to solve cold cases? Is it an essential tool for justice, or does it raise concerns about privacy? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this controversial topic. Share your opinions in the comments below. If you found this story as gripping as we did, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We dive deep into real-life cases just like this one, and you don't want to miss the next incredible story. Next time on The Crime Clock, we'll be diving into another incredible case that took decades to crack. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining us today.